The second worst mistake was arriving. The worst mistake was leaving. There is a certain arrogance inherent in human exploration, planting a flag in virgin land, as if that really meant music, something clear. I'm not entirely cynical. Mapping the world is more than greed and glory. It is also about facing the ancient fear of the unknown, mapping every corner of the world, so there are no hidden cracks to feed our nightmares. However, our endeavor is still selfish, and for centuries we have made the mistake of blindly believing ourselves superior. When discovering new lands, we have never stopped to consider a possibility. Disturbing that something other than man has already claimed that territory. Moderate your expectations, warned us Dror Krenz, our expedition leader, as we climbed a cliff more than 1,000 meters high. He grunted for handholds and footholds. In the unreliable cracks of the rock, we were not ascending any mountain. This natural skyscraper jutted out of the land with an almost square shape, like a squirrel peeking out of the hole in a sorting bucket. It was a flat-topped mound that emerged almost unnaturally in the middle of the forest, a strange mountain with leafy trees sprouting from its flat head. As if they were hair, we expected to find a virgin forest up there. We wanted to be the first to discover it. It was an Inselberg, a mountain island. These natural formations that rise alone on flat land are especially difficult to climb due to their almost vertical slopes, so we trusted that no human had ever reached its summit before the possibility of being the first explorers to set foot on that unexplored ground filled us with excitement in the 21st century. A piece of undiscovered land is a rarity. It took us almost 2 hours to reach the summit. Krenz was the first to disappear over the edge. Sharp, he crawled to the grass. He unclipped his carabiner and let out a muffled cry that made us quicken our pace to Howard Williams, Rachel Garcia, and I were eager to be a part of that momentous moment. I was the second to cross the edge and see the jungle with my own eyes. Not in photographs. I stood up, with my hands braced in the grass, and my jaw loosened as I stood before me. Stretched a green ocean, a canopy of leaves blocking almost all the sunlight, filling the forest with a mysterious calm. A calm we were about to disturb. We were a team of biologists and researchers accustomed to following in the footsteps of others. But this time we didn't stop to reflect. We were intoxicated by the idea of doing something original, of writing our own chapter in history. "What do you think?" Stepp asked Howard as he gathered up our climbing gear. "It's beautiful," I replied, shaking the mud and debris off my clothes. He rolled his eyes with a smile. I was hoping for something a little more, scientific, and I was hoping for at least 30 seconds to do my research. Howard joked. He laughed at what he said. "Under touche. I'm looking forward to seeing that cave," said Rachel enthusiastically. Dr. Krenz pointed ahead. "If we keep this pace, we'll be in and out before dark." "You seem confident," said Howard. "Sure you do. You don't need a moment to get your bearings at all. Williams, I've been religiously studying aerial maps for a month," Dr. Krenz said, "at the expense of my health. I must admit, yes, it was a little disconcerting to have a man yawning while climbing directly above me." I pointed, but after watching him work for so many weeks, I have no doubt I would be able to sleepwalk to the mouth of this cave. Our leader laughed, letting out a hint of excitement. "I'm not going to argue with that, Smithson. Come on, let's keep going, Go." Krenz was a naturally tense man. It reassured me to see him relax, even just a little, and allow himself to enjoy the moment. He rarely seemed joyful. His desire to climb this Inselberg in Mozambique seemed motivated not by pleasure, but by an urgent need, a need that drove him to, despite any apprehension, I might feel he was not a cold man at all. I had always seen him as a sort of father figure, stoic and reserved, but with a depth that could be perceived in the details. I wanted to help him relieve his anxiety about the expedition, so I hurried through the tall mopane trees that formed an almost impenetrable canopy, blocking the light of the sun. I tried to catch up with Krenz. Although he was twice my age, I was barely sweating. His pace was hard to keep up, so I settled right behind him. "This is a historic moment," I said with labored breath. Krenz grunted. "Yes, yes," I repeated, panting. "Yes, they didn't beat us." He finished. I shook my head. "They didn't beat us, I am sure of it. We were the first to locate this forest with the antenna. I'm not talking about recorded history." Krenz interrupted me a long time ago. "The man could well have you walked around here." "How?" I asked. "The sides are so steep, so hard to climb, even with modern gear." Sometimes Krenz started slowing down. "Things are not so obvious." Smithson suddenly stopped, and I almost ran into his backwatch. "Out," Stevie said. "Rachel getting too close to me. What's the reason for the delay, Slow?" "We found it," whispered Dr. Krenz. Our leader stepped aside, letting the rest of the team see what he had discovered in front of us. There was a hole in the ground, the entrance to a cave, a cavity that went deep into the interior of the mountain. "I will unload the equipment," said Howard. Starting to unbuckle his backpack, No Need answered Kenso Endo his flashlight and pointing it towards the top. "Look," we crawled to the edge of the entrance to the cave and followed the beam of light. The flashlight illuminated a walkway that jutted out from the interior surface of the cave. A rock slope that clung to the wall and descended in spiral. None of us spoke. For the next 30 seconds, we silently stared at all the surfaces the beam revealed. I couldn't be sure, but I assumed the sloping walkway continued all the way to the back of the cave, as the flashlight couldn't illuminate the floor at over 30 meters deep. We all finally accepted the inescapable implication of "the discovery is a staircase," she whispered. Rachel Krenz nodded. "Yes, Garcia. It's a staircase." "So we're not the first," sighed Howard. "All this effort to find a long-lost vestige of our ancestors," Krenz completed, taking a cautious step towards the rock slope. "Doesn't seem like a good idea." I said no. "We have no idea how old this is." "It's more than a primitive staircase," the leader announced, stamping with the soles of his boots. "The solid slope seems sturdy. Imagine the skill it would have taken to build something like this. Smithson, those ancient hands could have limited themselves to carving a tunnel into the wall of the cave, but they didn't put the stones together. They assembled them to form an intricate ramp. Think of the wonders that might be hidden below." Howard and Rachel followed our leader to the entrance, but I frowned, staying in my place. It doesn't fit me. What kind of prehistoric civilization would have been able to achieve something like that? None of the team members responded, and as I watched them advance, I understood that I had to follow them or stay alone, abandoned in a forest that did not fascinate me as much as I had expected. I chose to follow them. I hurried to catch up with them without realizing at first that everyone had stopped. They were motionless, staring in astonishment at the wall of the cave. "Careful," I said, with a smile, mocking Rachel's previous warning with which I almost collided. "Up here, there are no handrails." Rachel pointed at the wall. Look at this, Esther. I followed the light of Kren's flashlight until we found several lines of marks on the rock. The four of us approached the symbols. Although cautiously, since the space on the 1-meter-wide slope was limited, but getting closer didn't help answer our questions. The marks a mix between drawings and hieroglyphics. They seemed more unstable. The closer I got, it was as if the shapes were changing. They were constantly restructuring. I told myself, of course, it's just a trick of the light. But I felt uncomfortable. I had explored countless cave systems around the world, and I had never before felt afraid of the dark or the unexplainable. However, this place had a secret. I wasn't meant to know something in my mind, or maybe in my body, was rejecting. The cave was screaming that we, Music La Grill, had a distant expression on his face. He raised a trembling hand towards the wall with a gesture. Absent Kren's was always reserved, but I had never seen him. So his empty gaze seemed devoid of any thought. Control yourself. I told myself, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in your career. Don't ruin it. We should document it. She suggested Rachel cautiously, as Kren's brushed the engravings with his fingertips. Dr. Kren's, I don't think we should touch it. We could damage it. Damage it, Howard replied, laughing. It's a stone carving that has lasted millennia. It will survive the human touch. He didn't feel it, but Rachel, yeah, me too, show. I started to say. Then our intrepid leader let out a sharp cry of pain, making the rest of us startle. Luckily, we managed to stabilize ourselves on the slope and avoid a fall. Kren's pulled his hand away quickly, and the crunch that accompanied the movement did not come from his bones, but from the wall itself. Kreno exclaimed, "Howard, it's okay, yes." The man muttered. He raised his index finger to the light of the flashlight, showing a thin thread of blood running down the back of his hand. "How did you do that?" asked Howard. "Did you cut yourself on something?" I started to open my backpack. "I have the first aid kit here." The Dr. Krenz shook his head and illuminated the wall again with the flashlight. "It won't be necessary, Ario, only." I saw it just an instant before he removed the light, but my photographic memory did not fail. There was a change in the engraving. One of the shapes had disappeared. I didn't understand the glyphs, but I remembered one in particular, a trapezoid with 2 dots inside. I was sure it had been there at the end of the last row of symbols, exactly where Kreno had touched. I don't know why I didn't say anything to the others or why I let them continue descending into the cave, and even less I know why I followed them. There was something unhinged in that place, and in Music Us as we descended more and more. My eyes scanned the walls. The absence of terrified me. They had disappeared soon. An intense itch began to run through my skin, and only the adrenaline kept me from scratching. Half an hour later, we reached the end of the cave floor when Krenz came down the slope. He turned to illuminate us with his flashlight. We were all unusually quiet, which disturbed me. I didn't realize that, like me, Howard and Rachel were also scratching their skin. Their necks showed red marks made by nails. "I need to stop," Rachel muttered, staggering in response. Strangely, Kreno moved away, his flashlight pointed towards the dark tunnel that stretched in front of us, as if he hadn't heard Rachel according to my calculations. "This tunnel is not more than 30 acres. He grumbled at a quick pace. "We could reach the end in half an hour. We must continue, Garcia." I approached Rachel, whose trembling figure was barely visible under the dim light. Her skin was pale and her teeth chattered. When I put my hand on her forehead, the icy cold burned my skin. "Jarsit Krenz," I screamed. We have to get Rachel out of here. She needs medical attention. You are not a man of medicine." Krenz muttered without turning. I gritted my teeth. "I am a biologist. You know that, but I don't know what is happening to her." Rachel began to curl up on the ground, so I took my coat and a sweater out of the backpack and wrapped her in both. Howard. Meanwhile, he approached Crino and snatched the flashlight from him. Our leader didn't react. He just kept looking at the black abyss that stretched out before us when Howard handed me the flashlight. I couldn't help mumbling. I could have used some extra light as we went down the slope of death. I wanted to have both hands free. Howard said with a weak smile, "It's not my fault that you always forget the most basic things." I sighed. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be abrupt. It's that I know." Howard interrupted me, kneeling beside me to inspect our partner, frozen by the cold. "What's wrong? Rachel talked to us." "My stomach," she whispered, holding her abdomen with trembling hands. It burns," I asked, frowning. "But it's cold to the touch. I feel it." Rachel began, but her voice faded. Howard leaned closer, bringing his hand to his own stomach in an instinctive gesture. "We'll have to take a look. Is that okay?" Rachel nodded weakly, and our partner lifted her shirt carefully, but as soon as his fingers touched her skin, he let go, as if it had been burned. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. I expected to find swelling, a bruise, a cut, something that might explain what was happening to her. Something I could understand from a scientific point of view. But what I would never have expected was to see the bones of her rib cage, to see a hole in her flesh. Howard and I let out a scream in unison as we watched the hole in Rachel's abdomen begin to widen. The skin around the edges of the opening seemed to vanish into thin air, as if it were being devoured by invisible teeth. The rib cage itself began to show gaps that grew with each second, as if something invisible was chewing from within. But behind the disappearing bone and flesh, there were no organs, not even shattered remains of them in the void left by Rachel's skin. Were large crystals of a translucent blue, speckled with a substance reddish-brown. Howard couldn't help himself. He vomited immediately, barely managing to turn around in time. Although a few drops reached Rachel's body, that disgusting and shocking scene caused my own stomach to revolt, and soon I found myself expelling the contents of mine with the same intensity. When we both finished, I moved the flashlight away from Rachel's body, unable to continue looking at that opening that expanded unnaturally. However, directing the light towards her face was not much consolation. Rachel's face was completely devoid of color. Her eyes looked at me with a heartbreaking mix of pain and emptiness. She didn't seem aware of what was happening to her, which was perhaps a blessing. At least she was too weak to look down. At that moment I heard the sound of Krenz's footsteps through the dark tunnel, advancing without a flashlight. Apparently tired of waiting, I looked up and looked in the direction of the darkness, following the echo of their footsteps as they faded away. It was then when I felt something at the end of the tunnel. Something huge, motionless, and deeply evil, a presence that seemed to observe us from the abyss, but that despite its magnitude, remained invisible to human eyes. "What's wrong?" Rachel moaned, her skin tone changing from white to blue. "Nothing," I lied in a low voice. "How the hell is she still alive?" Howard shouted. interrupting the silence a heartbreaking cough. "Stop, Howard," I begged him, turning my attention to Rachel. "Are you okay? Everything is going to be okay. There are so many." Rachel whispered, with her eyes beginning to roll back. A shiver ran down my back. So many of what my colleague sketched a smile, while a thread of bare liquid escaped from the corner of his tightly closed lips. It was not blood, because it seemed that there was nothing left inside her. It was not really a smile. Of course, the muscles moved, placing his lips in the correct position, but that was nothing more than muscle memory. Rachel was no longer there. It was no longer she. Whatever it was that was looking at us through her body. He raised a finger and tapped gently on her. 100 now, a lifeless blue. "They are up there," he let out with a macabre giggle, tapping repeatedly up there, talking to each other. I hear them even. Now they are still. So Rachel, or what was left of her, trailed off before finishing the sentence. A moan of horror and sorrow escaped my throat. Although I felt a bitter relief in my chest, seeing Rachel's torment come to an end was in some way a starving rest, completed Dr. Kenso with a serious tone. Without hesitation, I pointed my flashlight upwards, looking away from Rachel's corpse. The leader of our expedition had not disappeared into the darkness as we believed, or if he had silently returned to his initial position. There he was standing at the entrance of the tunnel, with his back to us. He watched the black abyss in front of him. But something had changed. Something in him. He was no longer human when Howard and I saw him. We screamed in pure horror. The back of his head was missing. The head, the skin and bone had given way to an open wound that seemed to widen as if something invisible was eating me weakly as we both prepared to flee at full speed. I kept the flashlight focused on the ground, illuminating Dr. Krenz. He still didn't turn to look at us, but as I ascended the spiral staircase, I noticed his body began to lean, exposing the side of his face. When we were high enough, almost directly above Howard, he held me tight, shaking as much as I was. Then I leaned slightly toward the edge, letting the beam of light fall on Krenz. "Please stay there," I murmured in a small voice, more to myself than to him. But the scary thing was not Dr. Krenz. The scary thing was what his presence meant. His head leaned back unnaturally, almost making me slip. I was saved by Howard's firm grip. Kren's face leaned toward us, but he had no face anymore. "They're too small to be seen," whispered a voice that should not have come from him. An impossible voice without mouth or vocal cords. We entered his house, and now they enter ours. Kren's eyes empty and glassy, like Rachel's, focused on what was once his face. His mouth and nose had disappeared, devoured by something that continued to advance relentlessly. And when that invisible force reached his eyeballs, both became a red and white mist that vanished into the air. The only thing left were tunnels piercing his head from front to back. For an endless second, the beam of my flashlight passed through those cavities. Then the body of Dr. Krenz collapsed, becoming a shapeless mound of torn skin and bloody clothing. In no time, he and Rachel would be just piles of cloth and dry stains on the floor. Then from the depths of the cave came the sound, a cacophony of noises overlapping like the movement of countless tiny feet. They were moving at an incomprehensible speed, moving with a disturbing urgency. Howard and I saw nothing. There was nothing to see. They were too small to be seen. The floor of the cave 10 feet below us began to darken. It was as if a huge, unknown mass was gathering, Battalions of invisible entities that only manifested when they gathered in numbers impossible to measure. We didn't let scientific curiosity stop us. We didn't stay and watch the unknown. Howard and I ran up the spiral stairs. We climbed so fast we almost lost our balance, staggering. Music. But they didn't follow us to the end. They didn't leave the cave. They didn't cross the threshold into the jungle. We made it. We collapsed on the wet ground, our lungs begging for oxygen, and our bodies on the verge of collapse. That's when I noticed that something was wrong. Howard was too still. I crawled. To his body panting, and through tears he could barely speak when I arrived. The truth collapsed on me like a dry blow. Howard was not breathing. His remains lay in the mud. I don't know how he could run so fast or climb the stairs, because what was left of him was nothing more than bones covered by some strips of skin that hung from the skull with tears falling on my face. I unbuttoned his backpack. Then the impossible happened. Howard, or what was left of him, turned on his back, looking at me with the empty sockets of his eyes. I didn't move him. He moved, only the rest is a blur, a whirlwind of physical and mental horror. I am surprised to be alive to tell this story. I don't know how I managed to descend the steep slope of Lindbergh, to reach the airport and take a flight back to Paris. 90 hours passed, and I received more than 100 missed calls before the adrenaline completely faded from my body. Only then, in the solitude of my room, I faced a new horror. I woke up in the middle of the night, overcome by a hellish itch in the cave. It was just a slight tickle. But now I'm burning alive as an icy chill runs through my body. I scratch myself, and with every movement the skin comes off in strips. The wounds don't stop growing on their own. Something is consuming me from within, eating me piece by piece, something I can't see, too small to be perceived. I don't know how those things escaped, but they did. I don't know how I survived while the others perished so quickly, nor how I managed to get on the plane, and get to France. Except that I know, because I hear their voices, a constant murmur in my head. The same voices that serve that thing in the cave. The thing that watched me from the darkness. They didn't kill me right away. They wanted me to return to the human world, to take them with me. They needed a host, and I was their transport. Now they are the explorers. They are discovering our home, a place that they could never reach until I entered their lair and freed them. We entered their house and they entered ours. If I had known, I would have stayed in that isolated blue forest to music die. But it's too late on the plane. I noticed it. I thought it was my mind breaking from the trauma, but no, I wasn't imagining things. The passengers started scratching their skin at the end of the flight. Everyone was doing the same thing now. It's in the world, you're not safe. No one is. These things are too small to be seen. Too fast. Too greedy. Forgive us for what we did. I'm sorry.